Ring, ring.
Hello?
Hello, may I speak to Alan Jones, please?
You got him right here.
Jones on the drums is in the house. How you doing, Alan?
Good, how are you?
Wonderful. Happy Sunday.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you for spending Sunday morning with me
It's gonna be fun.
and joining me on the Lipstick Pickup podcast. I'm going to explain to my listeners who Alan Jones is and how we know each other. Alan Jones is a Nashville-based drummer, multi-instrumentalist, but primarily a drummer. And I've known him since he first came to town in 2010 or so. Did you say 11?
20, very beginning of 2011. Yeah.
Been here for 5 or 6 years before he was. And I didn't know him. We have a connection in the town of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, the hub city in
hmm
South Mississippi. And I actually didn't meet him there. I met him when he first moved to town. And I reminded him yesterday where we met, and it was at Whole Foods. Do you remember it? Do you remember
I
meeting me?
don't I don't remember that specific time. I was thinking that I probably ran into you and Kevin somewhere randomly around town. Probably around the same time, but I didn't remember that it was specifically at Whole Foods.
That was the first time.
Okay.
And I remembered it because I was so, oh, you moved from Hattiesburg? And then the next time I ran into you and Kathy. And of course, she moved here. Did y'all move here together?
We did.
Okay.
Yes.
And y'all are my Hattiesburg people. So we don't really know each other that well, but we have a familiarity with each other and we knew people in common. But here's what happened.
Lot of mutual friends.
A lot of mutual friends. What happened is my husband Kevin and I knew your friends, Scott and Jeremy and other
hmm
people. And you guys attended maybe went to a movie together or knew each other in Hattiesburg. Do you remember how you knew Kevin?
Well, because he worked with my friend Jeremy, and
Of
Jeremy and I were roommates for quite a while. During the era that Jeremy was working at the newspaper with Kevin, I lived with Jeremy. So I remember meeting Kevin back then, but I don't remember specifically like when I first met him. But I'm sure I probably saw him around town a few times.
Yeah, it's a small town, Hattiesburg. Small
Yeah.
city, small city. Anyway, so we were shopping at Whole Foods and Kevin knew you, ran into you and introduced you and said he's from Hattiesburg. And I was like, oh wow. And then every time I saw you, I'd usually do the same thing. Hey, Hattiesburgers with cheese. 'Cause that's what I love. I have a lot of I'm not from I'm not from Hattiesburg, but I went to school there and I spent a lot of time there. And so I have some civic pride. So that's how we met. And then
Yeah.
I would run into you inevitably on the scene. But, thanks to social media, I feel like I keep up in common with you. But that's how I
Yeah.
know Alan. And his handle on Instagram is still Jones on the drums.
Not anymore. I retired that a few years back.
I liked
Now it's
it.
just underscore my first and last name
Uh,
underscore. For I don't know. I reached a point where I didn't want to be one of those drummers who had to make the instrument my entire personality. So I was like, you know what? I don't have to make my Instagram handle. It doesn't have to have the word drums or beat or, these guys, some people come up with little names for themselves that are just kind of ridiculous in my opinion. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to use my name like a normal person.
I like the approach. It's very accessible. Okay. I won't, but you get used to calling people by their Instagram
But I'm not
handles.
offended by it. I'm not offended by that at all. I
Right
mean, my
on.
last name's Jones. I play the drums, so it's fine.
Alan Jones. And it's funny that your last name is Jones. And I may call this episode The Free State of Jones. Do you know what that story is about, the Free State of Jones?
So I know that refers to Jones County,
Yeah.
which is the neighboring county to where I grew up. Although none of my family from the Jones side of my family, I don't believe none of them are from Jones County. They're all from Clark County.
We're sliding right in then because I want to introduce you to my listeners and I'm looking forward to it because as I go about this sort of self-appointed music journalism career, I try to talk to people about the Pine Belt, about Hattiesburg and all these towns. And you're the first person I've had on that's really going to understand what I'm talking about when I talk about the Pine Belt. And I
Yeah,
can tell that you're from the deep woods.
I am. Although I've been told a lot in my adult life that I don't sound like I am.
That And
But
thank you. If I may be honest, I will tell you that my parents worked very hard to keep me from sounding like I didn't come from the sticks.
see, I had family members that got mad at me for pronouncing words properly.
Well, either
It goes
way,
both ways.
it goes both ways, but not everybody from Mississippi sounds like a hillbilly.
That's true.
I should try it because I notice, some of those performance types will move here and then they start talking real hillbilly.
Yeah. Well, what's funny is that I mean, I grew up around it. Like I tell people, like I speak fluent redneck. Like I understand the language and can translate it. I just don't naturally sound that way.
I'm gonna need a moment. I speak fluent redneck. Oh man, I'm stealing that. I'll give you credit. I speak fluent. It's like my favorite scene from Airport.
Airplane. I speak jive.
Excuse me, miss. I speak jive. It's the opposite. Excuse me, miss. I
Yes.
speak redneck. I can be assistance. You know all the codes.
Yeah, it's gotten me out of a couple jams for sure. Being a touring musician, breaking down on the road in the middle of nowhere, somebody comes up, you got to know how to speak the language. That
Yes,
way you don't get taken advantage of.
I can only imagine. Oh, man, we'll have to talk about that off the record some. Um, but so you're from the deep woods, and and then you moved to Hattiesburg, and you were part of the music scene there, and that's what I want
Mhm.
to know about you. I want to know about where you grew up and your family too, because this generational thing is going to be interesting to me, knowing what I know about that area in Mississippi. So tell me about it. Tell me about Alan Jones.
Well, I have an older brother who's 7 years older than me, and he was crucial in getting me into music. He just on his own as a young kid was kind of an obsessive music listener and just loved, stuff like Kiss and Van Halen and like the rock music of that time, and then kind of the
How much older was
he's
he?
7 years older than me.
That's a good number.
Yeah, and so just by default, like, I was just listening to music with him all the time from an early age. And so like then he got interested in playing guitar. It was like he kind of started to try to play guitar a couple of times as a kid, but I would say by the time he was like 14, 15, he really started trying to learn. And so that would have put me being like, 7, 8 years old. And I would mess around on guitar too, but I don't know what drew me to it, but for some reason I just decided I wanted to play the drums, which is odd because I didn't know anyone that played drums, didn't really have access to it, but I don't know if it was just like, well, he's gonna play guitar, I'll play drums. But
Sounds like a band.
yeah, and I mean, so I benefited from having as he would learn new things and figure things out, like I kind of got to learn it along with him, or I would try to figure out, well, if he knows how to play this song on guitar, I'll try to see if I can figure out how to play the drums to it, and so that was kind of the beginning of it. I ended up playing in a band with him and some of his friends that were his age. Kind of the beginning of that is kind of funny because when my brother was in high school, they had a high school talent show and he and his friends were going to play a Metallica song in the talent show. And they were practicing at our house, like literally practicing in my bedroom and where my drums were set up. And their friend that was going to play drums, they were like playing the song and everything. But like, I guess because they were in high school, their friend had an after school job, like at like Pizza Hut or something, or, something like that. So there would be a lot of times where like they would want to practice, but their friend couldn't come because he had to go to work. So I would just play drums with them. And they did the talent show, but they decided they were having so much fun learning that one song that they wanted to keep playing. But I ended up being the drummer because I was kind of already a little bit of a better player. Like I'd already been playing drums for a couple of years at this point, and their friend was just like that was the beginning of him trying to learn how to play drums. So I
Also,
kind of
it's
like
cute to have a kid on the drum kit.
yeah, so it's like, they're like 18, 17, 18 years old, and then they've got this literally little kid playing drums. But that kind of went on for a couple of years, even as my brother and his best friend had, I think they were going to Jones County Junior College in Ellisville. And, it went from us just playing cover songs to like they started trying to write songs. And then we were, playing our own stuff. And, so I was doing all of this with them when I was, like 12, 13 at the oldest. And which is looking back on it now, it's like I was learning so much while not even really being aware that I was learning. I was just doing it and having fun. And kind of the great thing about starting to play music when you're a little kid, you don't feel any of that weird pressure of like, am I good or am I bad? Or,
Yeah.
you don't think about that stuff. When people try to play music, when they try to start at a later age, you have all this like insecurity about, I'm not very good because I just started. But it's like, man, when you're 12, you don't care. You're just having fun. And
I'm
that's what
just a
keeps you
kid.
playing.
I'm just a kid.
Exactly. And but yeah, like that sort of thing, like playing with them, like playing with my brother, like, I benefited from learning alongside people who were older than me. And then, that led to me later like starting bands with people closer to my age, getting interested in different sort of kind of, I guess, subgenres of rock music and becoming more interested in just various different things that led to being in bands that would just play at house parties or play at like a big moment is starting to play in Laurel, Mississippi, and then eventually starting to play in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And there were things happening in both of those little towns that like that didn't exist in my little town.
Yeah.
For a long time, my friends and I that had our band, the band I was in after playing with my brother and his friends, we were the only band in our town. And, but like there wasn't really anywhere to play in our town. So we would go play in Laurel, which is the next town over. Um,
Where y'all from?
yeah, but it was, I mean, it was kind of there was kind of a repeating cycle there where I was playing with guy like one of which is Scott Parker, who
Yeah.
who and Kevin knows. When I started playing with him, he was also going to Jones Junior College, and I was just getting into high school. But they were meeting all of these people from the surrounding area. I benefited from that by like, well, I just get to go along with these guys, and now we meet other people who are in bands who are into the same things that we're into, and we're playing these shows in Laurel at all these random like little VFW buildings. Or there's
What?
actually one of the electric companies in Laurel had this like conference room sort of building that had a stage in it, and we would rent it. I don't think we even had to pay money. It's like you put down a deposit, you could have a show there, and as long as nothing was damaged and you clean everything up, you get the deposit back. And it was, I mean, I started doing that when I was like 14, probably 14, maybe 15. And there'd be like 150 kids.
Yeah.
And it was just that kind of started the path of like music being a little bit more of a realistic thing that I could do.
Yeah.
Because when I was little and I was listening to music with my brother and we were first learning how to play, all the stuff that we were listening to were these ginormous rock bands that when you see them
Will
on
you
TV,
name some of them? I'm curious what those influences were.
like Metallica, Iron Maiden, like
Yeah.
big metal bands and rock bands and stuff, that when you saw their videos, they're playing in these giant arenas and they have all these huge stage and lights and all of that. And at the time that like I loved that stuff, but it's like I don't even know another person that plays the drums. So that just seems like that is all happening on another planet. Like,
Yeah.
because at this point in my life, I'd never even been to a real city before. So I didn't know how anything worked. But that whole process of like just being in a band with my friends, playing a VFW hall in Laurel, and then starting to go play house parties in Hattiesburg, that's where everything started to become a little more realistic. And you kind of start to understand, like, oh, there's this whole underground do it yourself sort of world where
Mm-hmm.
if you want to be in a band and you want to play shows, you just make that happen kind
Mm-hmm.
of on your level.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you don't worry about the bands that are playing in arenas like I mean, that is like, that's a completely different world. You
Yeah.
just start doing the thing that you love and you do, work with what you
Yeah.
have. I mean, that's a huge part of growing up in Mississippi is like you don't have access to all the things, or at least back then, you didn't have access to all the things that people do now or people did in other places. So you just had to figure out a way to make things happen.
You had to cobble some things together. I grew up in Jackson, which was a city, and I used to see Van Halen at the Jackson Coliseum, Alan.
I later did see Metallica in Jackson at
It,
the Coliseum.
especially when I was growing up in the 70s. I was telling Kevin the other day, he was listening to Hall and Notes. I was like, I saw Hall and Notes and ELO at the Jackson Coliseum.
That's amazing.
I had a different experience, but I had a
Mm.
great boyfriend in college. I met him at USM. He was from Marks, Mississippi. It's up in the Delta, and it is a small town and shrinking smaller every day. And that I would go up, and he played. His dad was in music, and he played music. He played every instrument. He's still in music in a lot of ways. He manages the service department at Amro Music in Memphis, a big job. Anyway, I would go up there and they made it happen too. They had one little podunk club called the Junction that was on the railroad tracks, but everywhere else was a what did you say, a community hall or something or
Yeah, like there would be like, like the American Legion
yeah,
Hall was one of the spots we would or use or like some of the like volunteer fire department buildings, like you
yeah,
could rent their buildings out.
folding chairs,
Yeah,
paper cup.
totally.
I've been, so if there's people there, you can make it happen. And they
Hmm.
really they're not going to go without if there's people there. And that's what the whole story when we start talking about Mississippi is about. The reason why it's so rich with music is so much of it was remote, and it
Hmm.
had to make its own culture. And there's culture, music culture with the Pine Belt. Sorry to interrupt. Go back ahead. Tell me more.
Yeah, so I mean, kind of the whole like all through the years that I was in high school, every weekend, I was in high school in Waynesboro, Mississippi, but I was basically going to Hattiesburg on the weekends to play, whether it's house parties or there's a somewhat, if you're from that area, there's a somewhat famous bar that used to be there called Tal's Music Emporium, and I was playing shows at Tal's long before I should have legally been inside the building.
Hey, I want you to know, maybe you know this because you've been around the area. Do you know when I was in college, it was the Dart Bar. It was called Tal's Dart Bar.
Yeah, when my brother first started going there to go see bands there, it was called Tal's Dart Bar,
Yeah.
and that was another thing that was, I didn't realize it at the time, but I would figure out later. He and his friends, when they were going to Jones Junior College, they would go see bands at Tal's, and you would have these, regional, sometimes national, but regional bands coming through, and that was one of their stops was at Tal's, and so that was kind of like the beginning of, discovering unknown music because that you would otherwise never hear. But like this band came and my brother went and saw them and he would buy their cassette or buy their CD and come back. And then that would become bands that I would listen to. So there would be these like underground rock bands from Texas that we would have never known about, but like he would bring these CDs home and like I
I
was like, oh, I
remember.
really like this. And he would always have these there were these little postcards that they would print out the monthly schedule of all the shows. And then I'd been seeing those for probably 3 years or so. And then finally, my band played there, and we were on one of those cards. And that was like, I thought that was such a big deal because it was like all these bands that I liked that my brother bought the CD of, like, I'm playing that bar now, and my band's name is on there.
You know what's just occurring to me, even though we have a considerable age difference? It is entirely possible. But see, I graduated USM in 1990.
Okay.
So, okay, you would have been 10. So
Yeah,
you,
yeah. So
but
the
that's
era
how
that I'm
low.
talking about, like when my brother was going there and seeing those bands, this would have been like 92, 93,
Yeah,
probably.
I had just
And then
left.
I
Yeah.
think I played Towels for the first time either the end of 94, beginning of 95. I know that I was 15, and you're not definitely not supposed to be in there at age 15, but I did some creative things with fake IDs but I mean I wanted to play. And I mean that was all that was. It's like I wasn't really trying to do anything. I wasn't going there to attempt to get drunk or anything. I literally was just like I want to I want to play.
It's tremendous how long that bar had an influence because it started really influencing things. And you're right. Well, I saw regional people. I remember before I even graduated, I saw a band there. And then I went to a show in Atlanta. I started aspiring to move to Atlanta when I was in Hattiesburg. And
Hmm.
would see these bands in Atlanta. And I was like, wow, I saw you at Tal's Dart Bar. So they were getting great. The, there's always been some astute booking in Hattiesburg, which is why
For sure.
you and I, even with our age difference, we've had a similar experience. We saw, I mean, if we're going right into Hattiesburg, I was off camera, I was just telling Alan about some of the legendary shows that I saw at another club. Do you want to mention that one now? Or,
Oh, the Thirsty Hippo.
yeah. Did you play there in the early days? Did
I
they,
played there during the whole time that it was, I mean, the Hippo, Thirsty Hippo opened in 2000. So, I mean, I started playing there. I think the first band I was in that played the Hippo would have been in 2001. And I played there off and on up until literally a few months before I moved away and came to Nashville.
yeah, it was,
I mean, honestly, I probably played the Hippo at least 50 times
do you,
over a like 10-year span.
yeah, I did mean to cut you off, but
That's fine.
I want to talk about to keep telling me about the scene because that was a meaningful scene at the Thirsty Hippo. That was,
Absolutely.
yeah. Tell me more about Hattiesburg.
Well, you talked about, the people always, people booking in Hattiesburg always, kind of being ahead of things or just really being in tune. Brad, who ran the Thirsty Hippo,
He was a
was,
drummer too, wasn't he?
yeah,
Yeah,
great drummer
yeah.
in a few local bands in town. And he was really picky sometimes about who he would book, but he was also, sometimes he had really great instincts about what would work well there. And he was a rare, Towels is kind of the same thing, but a lot of the bars that kind of catered to like the fraternity crowd, they would book the cover bands and tribute bands and that sort of thing. Thirsty Hippo was always all original music. And that meant that sometimes he would book touring national bands or regional bands that no one had ever heard of, but he heard them and thought they were cool. And some of those bands, came and played, and then they would come back, probably once or twice a year, and the place would be packed every time they came through.
I remember
And I
some
mean,
of.
I mean, that's another place where like so many bands played before they went on to be much bigger. I mean, just off the top of my head, like Lucero playing there.
I saw it.
My band played with Mastodon there. I think he booked what Folk Implosion played there. What was the band? I think they were called the Twinemen, which was like the other members of
I was at that
Morphine.
show. I was at that show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, just so many shows. And then even bands that like weren't
Here's one I
necessarily big.
remember: Phantasma from Austin.
They were like Hattiesburg was like their second home. Like
Yes.
it was packed every time they came through. There was yeah, them. There was I was trying to remember. You brought up a band. We were talking about Red Elvises earlier.
Yeah.
There was a band from Portland that came to the Hippo a couple of times that were kind of had this like almost like what would you call it? I don't know if the forgive me if this is not the right word, but almost like a like gypsy rock sort of vibe that
From
was kind of
Portland.
theatrical. I just remember the guy they had this toilet that they brought out and they would like set fire inside the toilet bowl and the dude would cook chicken on he'd like set like this grill plate cover over the toilet and cook pieces of chicken while they were playing and then pass it out to the audience.
You're not talking about Southern culture on the skids, are you?
No,
No,
no, no, no,
because they would
no.
throw out chicken wings at some
Right,
point.
right. No, I
I
mean
don't.
that.
I'd never seen that. I never saw that band, or I would remember it. But there was so many. Grupo Phantasma was a huge band too. You know, they had horns and everything else, and they would
Yeah.
squeeze them in. You remember that there wasn't a real stage at the
No,
Thirsty
you played
Hippo.
on the
What would you
floor.
describe?
I mean, you're playing on the floor.
Yeah,
That room, I mean, if it's packed, you're talking 100 people. But then where the band played, there were big plate glass windows, and so you would have people outside in the courtyard. So it's like it's almost like you're playing in the round. This like 360 experience. I have some photos of myself and some of my old bands where it's like there's people standing in front, and then you got people standing like watching us from the windows because there was also like a double
And the
door that
heads
was
are
open.
sticking in. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I
I
mean,
remember.
there were so many. I mean, just not only going to see shows like from the audience perspective, but I mean, so many shows that I played there that were just like it was so fun because it had such a unique vibe to it.
It did. That courtyard in the back, and it had the trees and the Christmas lights. And, when Grupo Fantasma, I remember them because they were so huge. The band filled up the club, because they had horns and everything. Can't remember the lineup of that band, but it was a big band. And I just remember the people hanging their heads in the windows. And I'm glad to know that you have some photographs because you and I have talked about the absence of photography of some of the great stuff. And that place, I had so many memorable nights there, and I told you that I saw Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings first tour, man.
Yeah.
Right there on the floor. She was dancing right in front of me.
And that was probably one of those things where whether it was the band themselves or their booking agent, somebody probably just sent a demo to Brad. He listened to it and thought this will be cool, and he booked it.
He had the
And it turned
nose.
and it turned out to be something awesome.
And the one thing I loved about the scene there is that he and Harry Crumpler at T-Bone Records,
Hmm.
shout out T-Bone
Yeah,
Records,
I love T-Bones.
they built a community, right? So
Hmm.
Harry would let everybody know this is going to be a good show. Harry said and they would street team it, basically. They would be an awareness. Brad not only got those bands there, but he made sure he got people there. He got the
Yeah.
word on the street. And anyway, keep on telling me about. Tell me some of the names of the bands that you were in. I want to try to get a sense of if I ever saw you play around that era.
So myself and Scott Parker, the band that started when we were still living in Waynesboro, and then later we were basically a Hattiesburg band for a while. It was called Feature Seven, and
Okay.
that was like kind of a punk rock band. Kind of sounded like '90s punk rock stuff of the time. That I mean, that's the stuff we were listening to.
Hmm.
Uh, we that band so that band ended before the Hippo came along. We played Towels a few times throughout the years.
Did you go up to Jackson much?
That band did a couple of times. Oddly enough, all my years growing up playing in Mississippi, I only played Jackson a handful of times, and it always felt like it was kind of tough to get gigs there. And then
Made
kind
more
of
sense to go west and east than it did north and south, probably.
yeah, but also I feel like especially going into like the thousands decade, there was just more going on in
Mhm.
the Hattiesburg music scene. All the bands in Jackson were coming down to play Hattiesburg more than they were playing in Jackson.
That's true.
Like it would, because my bands, like we would do the thing with other regional bands around the South where we would do show trades where like, we would go play with a band in Mobile, Alabama, and then they would come play with us in Hattiesburg. We did that sort of thing. That was kind of how we built a network around the Southeast. Kind of related to that one, a few years back, Kathy and I went to Atlanta to see a band that was like it was a reunion tour. They were only playing a few dates, and closest show was Atlanta. So we went, and there were some people that were there with us, and I literally saw people that I knew from every state in the Southeast through my touring band experience of like, oh, it's so and so from this band and this band, and like as we're standing in line to go into the show, I'm going to talk to my friends that were from Shreveport, or I'm talking to my friends that were from Baton Rouge, or Nashville, or Mobile, or Montgomery, Alabama. And the people that were with us were like, how do you know all these people? And I'm like, if you're from the Southeast and you play this style of music, you're all connected. Like you figure out how to find each other, and like you build your sort of community because we all come from areas, or we all have this similar background of like if you truly love this sort of thing, you have to put in some work to like make that stuff happen.
Yeah.
You form friendships with people. I mean, people that I still keep up with to this day that I've known for over 20 years now. And it's all through just meeting people. Sometimes it goes back as far as either calling people or literally sending people letters in the mail through like connecting through things like fanzines and just all kinds of stuff. I
It's
mean,
called a circuit.
it is, and it's probably wild for people of a certain age to grasp that because people that have grown up with the internet, never experienced anything like that.
Remember all the shows that I used to go down and see in New Orleans in the 80s, and I still don't know how I bought the damn tickets. Like I used to see legendary shows at the Tipitinas. I saw them,
Mhm.
I saw the Ramones there, I saw the
Oh
Replacements
God.
there, I saw the Pogues there. I
Yeah.
saw they Might Be Giants there on their first tour. And I don't have ticket stubs. I think it was a thing you call on the phone, get the will call,
I remember doing that.
I,
Or sometimes just showing up to shows and paying when I got there, hoping that it
yeah.
wasn't sold out.
Or sometimes by being able to buy tickets at record stores in Hattiesburg, you
Yeah,
know,
if it was I used to have to
beautiful
work.
day.
I used to have to work the Ticketmaster counter at my job in the mall in Hattiesburg.
Wow,
Yeah,
yes. Man, what is the name of the mall?
Turtle Creek Mall. So when I first started working there, the store was called Disc Jockey, later became FYE. But when I first
Oh,
worked
yeah,
there, when it was Disc Jockey, there was a counter at the back of the store with a separate computer that's where you went to buy Ticketmaster. That was the Ticketmaster outlet in
yeah,
Hattiesburg.
yeah.
And I have still have flashbacks of doing that sometimes.
I don't, I have piles of ticket stubs, and most of the shows I've seen in my life produced no stubs. So this is like just a fraction of the things that I've seen, and I never really meant to archive them. What I would do in the years that I owned CDs, I'd come home from the show, I'd take the stub out of my thing and I'd stick it in the CD jacket. I've got a wall of CDs. I've got thousands of CDs. That's why I don't need to have vinyl records to prove I have great taste. I have thousands. I don't need to join the vinyl arms race. I've got proof that I've got great taste in music. And
Yeah. I unfortunately lost a lot of my CDs over the years.
they were a source of pride for me because I was proud of my collection because I had the most impressive collection of anyone I knew, and I'm still proud of them. And Kevin and I have gotten rid of hundreds of them, just to lighten the load. But anyway, not talk about me. But yeah, but I would stick the ticket stub in the CD jacket, and still to this day, I pulled one down, and there was a Delamitri song list and ticket stub from 1992. Do you know this band Delamitri
Yeah,
from Glasgow, Scotland?
I remember them.
Hold on, I want to show it. One little show and tell. Kevin's going through my CDs the other day, and he goes, "Hey, look, I found this all folded up in a CD case, and it's a set list from and a ticket stub, Ticketmaster, at the Variety Playhouse in 1992. I saw Delamitri."
Nice. I played the Variety Playhouse in 2021.
So I want to talk to you about um the stuff that you've done. Do you have anything else more to say about Hattiesburg and the music that
Well,
you played there? Because I
so
want
I
to
mean,
talk to you about what you've done here in Nashville. So go ahead.
okay, so I mentioned the first band. I was in a band called Feature Seven. I won't go through all of them because some of them were kind of short-lived and stuff. The band, I guess, starting probably in about 2004, I was in a band called An Into October, and that
I
was the
remember
first
that name.
band where like we really started really trying to go out and tour. And we played all over the place. I mean, we played Seattle, we played New York, we played LA, everywhere in between. We had tons of horror stories of vans breaking down, all that sort of stuff. Band that's 4 out of 5 members of that band. Then that changed into being called Malamute. Same thing. We didn't go to the West Coast in that band, but we did a lot of touring in the eastern half of the country. Put out a CD through an indie label that was based out of Alabama. And then that lasted probably until not terribly long before I moved to Nashville in early 2011. Basically, the funny thing about that is like when I was growing up, I never had any aspirations to be like session drummer or like I used to buy drum magazines when I was a kid if they had somebody on it that I was interested in from like a certain band. But I would read about these drummers who are like so and so is like the number one guy to call in LA to play on your record or whatever. I thought that was cool in a way, but I never really wanted to be that. But as the bands I was in Hattiesburg, as things kind of started to fizzle out, where we've kind of reached a point where we felt like we've kind of done all we can do, you know, people started getting real jobs or going back to school or whatever it is, life starts to happen for people in various ways. And I didn't want to stop playing. Like all I wanted to do was play. So I just thought, maybe I'll try a different approach. And instead of starting a new band, maybe I will just try to do some sort of have a musical career for myself in some capacity. And that's what led me to moving to Nashville. And it's funny to think back now because it's like I really didn't have a plan. I really didn't know what I was doing. I was just going to show up and jump in. And it's
Hey,
kind of what I did.
that plan wouldn't have done you any good anyway.
Yeah, I realize that now because, it's like you make these plans, you end up having these preconceived ideas of how things work. And the thing that I learned really quickly upon moving to Nashville was that even though I had been playing music for a long time and I had done, I toured the country a few times, had been playing my instrument since I was a small child. I learned very quickly once I got to Nashville that there was so much that I did not know about what it takes to be a professional musician. And the only way to learn is to jump in, and you're going to have to fail at a few things a few times. Or, luckily you learn lessons really quick and you're able to adapt. And I had to really get out of my comfort zone as far as the music that I was playing, play some things I never thought I would play before.
I bet.
Probably played some things that I'll probably never play again, but you have to take some kind of positive experience from everything. I mean, I can think of so many stories of gigs I've done or tours I've been on where it's just like, oh, I kind of cringe at that. But I also learned some things and I had some experiences that I otherwise would never know
Yeah.
had I not done those things. But
It built character, right? It built character.
yeah. And you just, you have to learn by doing. You can't, there's no, you can't just read about it or, look up Wikipedia or just do research about it. It's one of those things that the only way to really know how to do it is to go try it
Yeah.
and do it. But yeah, I, moved here, had a few odd jobs early on while I was, also playing gigs, going out on tours, recorded some stuff pretty early on here. And so kind of got a pretty quick lesson in what a professional recording studio is like as compared to what I was used to in Mississippi, which had sort of varying degrees of professionalism, some great, some not great.
Yeah.
But again, you learn how to work with what you have when you live there. But yeah, you mentioned you and I meeting in Whole Foods. I worked there for a little bit. A lot of people that worked at Whole Foods were musicians, including Lily Hyatt, who worked there at the same time that I did. And that's how I got to know her. And I would later end up doing some touring with her and playing on one of her albums.
Which
And
one was it?
that album's called
Trinity Lane?
Trinity Lane that came
Yeah.
out in 2017, I believe.
Every time I've run into you, I always bring up Lily Hyatt because I'm a huge fan of her father's. It's not the
Yeah,
same thing. She's her own person, but
she
we always
is.
have that. I've seen her perform before, but I don't think I've ever met her in person. But I
Mhm.
admire her, and she looks just like her father. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just I know that she's extremely talented, but I
Mhm.
gotta admit that I hadn't spent any time yet to really listen to her music. So yesterday I went to listen to Trinity Lane, and it is a superb record.
I love it. It's one of my favorite things I've played on. And that is a unique experience for me because we didn't record that album in Nashville. That was recorded in South
Really?
Carolina.
Wow.
Yeah, that was so I don't know if you're familiar with the group Shovels and Rope.
Yes.
So Michael Trent from Shovels and Rope produced that album and we recorded it in Shovels and Rope in their house. They've since built an actual studio behind that house, but at that time they were just recording a lot of their own stuff, like their own albums and stuff. They were just recording in an upstairs room of their house, and we recorded that album there. And another unique thing about that recording experience, it's the only time I've ever recorded drums where I tracked the drums and the cymbals separately.
Hmm.
So I would do a take of a song where I wouldn't hit the cymbals. I would just play the actual drums. And then we would go back, I would do a second pass and I would only play the cymbals. And I had to really think about my parts
What was the theory there?
because there was a very minimal miking setup.
Okay.
And that way also they could control when mixing the album, they could control the volume of the cymbals independently from everything else because part of the thing with recording drums, cymbals are kind of a thing that can very easily get in the way of things.
I can imagine.
And so there's some songs on that record where it sounds like I'm not really playing any cymbals at all, whereas I did record cymbal parts, but it kind of gave them the option when they mixed the album of like how much of the cymbals do they want there. Maybe there's not as much there because those frequencies might interfere with an acoustic guitar or another instrument that kind of takes up that same sonic space, and then also having to blend that with vocals. So that was interesting because
This makes total sense to me. I totally understand it now.
it's I mean it's a common, I mean there's other, like there's some famous records that have been recorded that way, but that's the only time I've actually done that, and it was a thing that I didn't know ahead of time we were going to do. It wasn't until literally day one starting to record, and the producer was like, have you ever tracked cymbals and drums separately? And I was like, no. And he's like, do you want to try? I was like, sure. But I got the hang of it, and luckily, my
Another
my
skill.
parts, I mean, the parts on that record aren't super complex, so but I just had to make sure I had to be aware of what I was playing
Yeah.
in every capacity, because, it had to be one of those things where like, well, if I can't hit a floor tom in this section and a snare because I have to overdub a cymbal and I don't have three arms, so there can't be three things happening at once. I have to think about the placement of things.
I'm looking forward to listening to the record again and thinking about that. I do immersion listening. This whole thing, that's why I don't pretend to be familiar with music that I'm not familiar with. I
Mhm.
really put it on and I listen to it from start to finish, just like intended by the artist. I didn't go and listen to one track. Oh, that's clever. Oh, I like her. It's not one of those
Mhm.
things. I went and listened, went on a long walk and I listened to the whole record and I thought it was fantastic. Really listening for everything, the
Yeah.
tone, the songs, and everything else, and the drumming. I was listening for your drumming. And it's a killer record. No, go ahead. Tell me about her, what you felt
I just
about that record.
I think she's a great artist. She's a great writer, and a lot, it's inevitable that if you mention her name, her father's name comes up because her father is a legendary
Yeah.
artist. But I mean, having worked with her, toured with her, like she does not coast on that. Like she is a worker.
She
Like
was working at Whole Foods with you. That's how you met.
exactly, and even still to this day, like she just put a new record out a couple months ago that is also great,
Uh,
and she's been out touring, and I mean like she's as real as any artist can be. Like she puts in the work.
yeah,
And
it's not a nepotism kind of situation. I've never gotten that vibe from her at
yeah,
all. As I've watched her operate as an artist, and I can tell she's a worker. So I was really delighted to listen to that record. And she's cool. I've never met her, but we know people in common. So I like her.
yeah,
When
yeah.
I meet her, I'm going to go, I like you, Lily.
But yeah, so I went from kind of, or I guess shortly before that album was released, in the same year that that was released, I started playing drums for Will Hogue. And so, that was kind of a weird transition, because that was when I made that record with Lily, that was her first album for the label that she signed to. And there was a lot of like, there's another thing that took me a long time to get used to with being just a hired player, or, having to think of things in terms of just myself instead of thinking about a band.
Hmm.
It's something that still doesn't come naturally for me. I'm not really a great like self-promoter type.
Hmm.
But I found myself in this position where I made this record with her. I had done some touring. I really liked playing with her. I really liked the other people in the band. I felt like all of that was meshing together really well. But the business side of things starts to inevitably always interferes in some way. And the way that happened was that we'd made this record that we all thought was going to be great. We knew it was coming out later, but there was also like, we didn't know what the touring plan was, because I think she was in between booking agents, and not to get too far into
Yeah.
people's like, business dealings, but being in my position, it just put me in a spot where it's like, I don't know what's happening in the next little while, and I have to figure out what I'm going to do. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, I get a text from Will Hogue, who got my number from going back to the Mississippi days, my buddy Jerry Pentecost, who is like
Oh, okay.
everybody knows who Jerry Pentecost is
Yeah.
in Nashville at this point.
Is he
I
from
know
Mississippi?
no, he's from Nashville, but he used to be in a band. I met him in 2000, and my band played a house show outside of Shreveport, Louisiana. And his band at the time was called Oliver's Army. They later became Sound and Shape. When I moved to Nashville, I ended up being the drummer in Sound and Shape. So Ryan, who is the main guy in Sound and Shape, I'm still good friends with him to this day. Still friends with Jerry. I've known those guys for 20 years now, going back to those old DIY booking shows around the South days, being based out of Hattiesburg. But Jerry is the
Amazing.
person who passed my number to Will Hogue,
Killer.
and Will Hogue got in contact with me, and it was like he had already recorded an album that was coming out the same year, had to put a touring lineup together behind it, and it was like, we're going to Italy and Spain and the UK this summer. Are you interested or available to do this? And I was like, I feel like I have to. Like I can't say no to this, even though like I just made this record with Lily that I feel really strongly about. So that was a tough decision. And
Yeah.
then, but the funny thing is, all through 2017, I was on tour with Will. Lily was out touring, promoting the album that I played on, and we were basically always like a couple of days apart in every city. Every venue I would go to with Will, I'd show up and there would be the poster of Lily High at Trinity Lane. Even in Europe, like all over the US, and then like I get to Stockholm, Sweden, and I'm sound checking like, oh, there's a Lily poster on the wall.
Who
So
ended
we
up
ended up
replacing you in that?
she had a few
Yeah, okay.
drummers. I don't know.
Yeah. Hey.
But I did at various times. I have gone back and like played a few shows here or there with Lily, like as a fill-in when she didn't have somebody available and I was available, I would go play. But yeah, but I ended up, going on tour with Will and ended up playing with him for about 6.5 years. I did 3 albums and toured all over the US, went to Canada, went to Europe a few times, did a lot of stuff with him, a lot of pretty like monumental experiences for me
Yeah.
playing with him. And then I guess around probably like the end of 2023, I don't know, it kind of got to where like I wanted to get back into being more of a creative, like not just playing other people's songs, but getting back into like writing music and doing something that I had a little bit more creative. I don't know about creative control over, but just
Is that a
yeah, yeah. And the thing about being a hired player is like one of the things that I have working against me is that I don't love all music. I really love the stuff that I love, but that's kind of where being a hired player in Nashville becomes kind of tricky for me, because I think I realized really kind of starting during the COVID lockdown when everyone was forced to stop.
yeah.
There's this weird, like, when you're pursuing like the hired player career, you always feel like you're not doing enough. You can't, whether you want to or not, you can't help but sort of do the comparison thing
Yeah.
and it just always looks like everyone else is somehow doing more than you. But then once I was forced to stop, I kind of look back on like the previous like few years and realized like I actually did a lot. I actually did far more than I thought I did. And like, I actually realized that, like, there were the things like playing with Lily or touring with and playing with Will that, like, those were great. But a lot of the stuff that I was doing in between just to fill the gaps and just to have something to do, I didn't really, once I couldn't go do that stuff, I realized I don't know that I want to go do that anymore. I think I only want to play the things that I truly like. And
When you talk about basic session work, like, hey, we put drums on this and drums on that, and it's like music you're not into, and you're like,
yeah, fortunately with recorded stuff, I haven't really done much that's out there recorded that I didn't think was good. Like, I mean, because I have turned down stuff before where like, hey, do you want to come do this? And I've been like, I'm not the right person for that. I have, on the flip side, eked my way through stuff when I needed to. Like I did get
Oh, I
hit
can
up
do
one
that.
time. Yeah, it was like, hey, we need a tour. We need somebody that can play rock but can also do like jazz and R&B on this tour. Can you do that? And I'm like, I am not a jazz drummer by any stretch of the imagination, but I said that I was, and I went and did that tour. But I also like I did, make the effort and do the work to like actually do a good job. And the people that I played with were happy with it. And kind of a point of pride for me is like most of the people I've played with since coming to Nashville have always asked me back. Like I've always put in enough of an effort and made sure that I did a good job so that like I've always had people call me back.
Yeah.
And I've always tried, and part of that also is like I've tried to stay, never had any like crazy dramatic things where things ended on bad terms. It's like I'm still friends with Lily. I would go play with her if she called me up, and I'm still friends with Will. It's just stuff changes.
Yeah.
That's part of it.
Jazz drumming. Love it. All right, let's see where well, I'm on track. I got some good stuff from you about the Hattiesburg music scene, and we talked about anything else you want to talk about Nashville because we have to get to the portion that everybody came for, which is the gear talk portion.
Boy.
Because,
Mm.
well, I really did a poor job at introducing this whole thing, and I want to tell the listener the reason why we're talking today is that a couple of weeks ago, I drove through Mississippi and I stopped at the Peavey plant, and I got an inbox from um, Alan, and he said, "Hey, I worked at the Peavey plant in Leakesville," and I said, "I want to talk to you." And when I called him about it, Alan Jones, I started realizing it would be a great way to talk about the whole Pine Belt issue as far as like all of this stuff as it relates to the whole tone story. My podcast is called The Lipstick Pickup, and it's about tone. And
Mhm.
it's Masonite and PV are right down the road from each other. And while they aren't the same kind of products, they do represent this innovation, Pine Belt pride. It's all about Pine Belt pride. And Alan is the perfect person to talk to about this because he was born and raised in the Pine Belt.
That's right.
Would you call Waynesboro the heart of it? It's right there, south of the Jackson Prairie.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely part of it for sure.
So when you were growing up around there, was it deep woods everywhere you looked? I mean, was it pine trees everywhere?
Yeah, yeah. Especially like the area, yeah, like before I moved I mean, Hattiesburg kind of is too, but yeah, definitely where I'm from.
Yeah,
It's all pine trees.
it's just pine trees everywhere you look. And
Hmm.
this is a section I want to put in a little history lesson. And I'm sure you know this. Waynesboro, it's all about the trees and the railroad. Nothing would be there if it wasn't for the trees and the railroad. Didn't you
Yep.
tell me your family was in the logging business?
Yes.
Yeah,
And that same railroad, you could take the railroad that runs through Waynesboro, Mississippi, that runs parallel to Highway 45 straight up to a little place called Shibuda, which is where my dad's side of the family came from.
yeah.
And yeah, they were in the timber industry.
Was
And then
Shibuda?
straight up, yeah, all of that stuff is Shibuda. I mean, Chickasahaya River, Shibuda, Pachuta, all of that stuff is all of it is that Highway 45 that runs uh, north and south through Waynesboro, up through that little town, a little community of Shibuda, runs straight up through Meridian. You could take Highway 45 straight north out of Meridian. It goes all the way up through Tupelo,
Uh-huh.
runs all the way up into Jackson, Tennessee.
Yeah. And I want to give a little lesson on the Pine Belt for my listeners. And I know that I'm not teaching you about the Pine Belt, but I might be reminding you of some things. The reason why I got so interested in the Dan Electro story, besides being a wannabe DJ and rock historian, is that my dad worked for Masonite. That's what these are made out of. And
Hmm.
Masonite was patented in Laurel, Mississippi at the turn of the century. And my dad was a trained timberman. They brought him there because he knew how to grow trees. Grow trees. He had learned at the University of Michigan forestry program. It's still the top forestry program in the country and probably the world. And my dad, they brought him in there to help grow trees. So before our talk this morning, I went to go remind myself of the Pine Belt, and there was nothing there. until the late 1800s. It was the deep woods, really deep woods. It was a very remote area, and there wasn't much going on there except for Native Americans, you know? And then the rest of America starts to discover not only discover the considerable natural resources of the pine belt, which is all about the longleaf pines.
Hmm.
They couldn't get to it, but once in the late 1800s, they start building out these railroads. They can finally get into the deep woods, and that's why Waynesboro is Waynesboro. I mean, it's about the railroad and the pine trees. It's impressive to me that your family is generationally there. That's interesting. And I don't know if you know this, but Waynesboro then got even more of a boom town when they discovered oil there. Do you know about the oil business there?
Yes. I mean, I remember that always being around. I knew that there were like a couple of companies there that were kind of a big deal
Yeah.
in that world. I mean, honestly, I feel like when I was growing up, everybody's dad was either in logging or oil,
Yeah.
pretty much.
That's why this whole Beverly Hillbilly story, they did strike oil in the woods all the time. And my
Yeah.
father was in the timber. He didn't work for Masonite very long, and he decided to go to work for the landowners, which is why he wrote this book. How to make money growing trees. At first, he wrote his first one in the 50s, and then he redid it in 89. And it's the Bible on how to tree farm. And the reason why they needed it is those trees were gone by 1930.
Hmm.
There was nobody there in the 1800s, and they built the railroads. They come in there and they clear cut it, and they build out America. Logs everywhere from telephone poles and everything else, and they clear cut it. They didn't plant trees. There was no sustainable tree farming, and I read it that it was completely depleted of forest resources by 1930, and that's why by after the war in the late 1940s, they needed a trained forester to come in there and start reforesting that area.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember as a kid, like large areas, like you would drive down a road in the area where I grew up, and it was like you could tell that all of those trees were ones that were replanted
Yeah.
after being clear cut because they all grew in straight lines.
My
You could
dad
see.
I'm jumping in here excitedly because this is my pride. My dad taught them how to do that.
Hmm.
Nobody knew how to do that. They brought him. And I think that's why my dad didn't work for Masonite very long, because he realized the reason why I was going to talk about this is the oil business. He starts reaching out to all these people with land in the area. The motto for his company, James and Vardaman and Company, was "Your timber is worth more than you think." That's what his letterhead said. He wanted to
Hmm.
get in contact with all the landowners and let them know, I'll help you sell your land. I'll help you replant it. I'll help you manage it. And very often he would give people advice on buying some land. And it was great timberland. Then, damn, they struck oil on it too.
Yeah.
The reason why I have a fancy portrait of myself when I was a young girl, my dad, he was a fairly successful businessman, but not like the means of the people that he was dealing with. They had generational money, land, oil,
Hmm.
timber. And he had made a recommendation to a guy. He said, "Yeah, I think that's probably a good piece of land that you buy, but not professionally." The guy struck oil on that land. And he wanted to give my dad some money, and my dad was like, "I wasn't working for you professionally. I just told you I thought it was a good idea." And so instead of in lieu of payment, he paid to have a portrait done of all my dad's kids. It was because of my dad that somebody had stuck oil on some land my dad told somebody to buy.
Wow.
But that's why we meet together in the Pine Belt.
Hmm.
I understand the rich musical history because of the story you told about the activism that you had to have music in, was it Shibuda or Waynesboro at that time?
I mean, yeah, like I mean, that whole area, it's just, it's literally the kind of thing where it's like, I'm interested in this thing that I've listened to and heard and seen from other areas, but we don't have it here. But
Yeah,
so the only way you're going to have it is to make it yourself.
build it.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's an interesting story. And the reason why I want to put this out there in my discussion on my podcast is that everybody, hey, what happens when you tell people you're from Mississippi, Alan? They assume
It
that they
depends.
assume you know something about the blues. They assume that you know something about the blues. And
That, or they assume that I grew up playing the blues,
yeah,
or they think I'm from Biloxi because that's the only town they've heard of.
they're suspicious that you don't sound like a hillbilly for like the North Mississippi. But
Yeah.
People from around the world are interested in the musical legacy of Mississippi for good reason.
It's where it all came from.
This is the richest soil in the United States for pain and ingenuity. And so the whole state is interesting. And I'm holding up a map for our visual listeners. And I sent this to Alan. I said, this is our agricultural cheat sheet. And it's like a map maybe of 100 years ago. And it talks about the agricultural land. And most people associate blues with King Cotton up in North Mississippi and picking cotton. But down here, you have your own kind of blues. Yeah, I mean, not even blues, musical traditions.
Hmm.
The opera singer Leontine Price is from Laurel, Mississippi.
That's right.
She was a black opera singer. She's still
Yep.
alive, by the way. She's very much still alive. I can't believe it. Leontine Price is still alive. So Pine Belt Pride. So, and that's why I wanted to wrap that neatly in a bow for my listeners to know, which is why I want to talk to you about Peavey, because Peavey is all about Peavey. It was based in Meridian, and I
Right.
was technically, and I was surprised to find out that Meridian's not considered part of the Pine Belt, but you and I both kind of do because they want to take the logs there, right? And it's all about the bigger
It's close
city.
enough. Yeah.
Yeah, in the bigger city and all the processing and the timber processing and everything else. And anyway, so Peavey was founded in Meridian, Mississippi, and it's an interesting story. And we're not going to get into that now. I'm not going to school everybody on Peavey, but Alan worked at the plant. He worked at
Yes.
the one of them.
One of them.
That's how big of an operation Peavey is. And Alan can talk about his reverence for the amps and the instruments, and he can also tell us what it was like to work there. So let's talk about Peavey Electronics.
Well, they had a factory in a little town called Leakesville, Mississippi. And that factory, I mean, a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere. And that is where the Wolfgang guitars, which were the Eddie Van Halen signature model guitars, that's where those were built. That was during Peavey's brief foray into the drum world. So the Peavey drums were built there, at least the high-end drums were built there. They had some cheaper drums that were imported that had the Peavey name, but the flagship Peavey drums were built at that same factory that I worked at. There was a couple of other like signature model, the Steve Cropper signature model Peavey guitar was built there, and then a few different other models of guitars and basses. And I was 19 years old when I worked there. I started in the buffing room, which is where bodies of guitars and basses that had had their first coats of paint put on, and you had to hold the body and hold it against this buffing wheel. And everybody was at a station with like these two different buffing wheels with different, I guess different roughness of wheels to buff out
Yeah.
the paint. And I started there first. I think my first day there, the guy was showing me what to do. I was holding a body of, I don't remember what model, some kind of bass. And these, buffing wheels are spinning really fast. And he's showing me how you're supposed to hold it and angle it to like get everything. And then I lose grip, and then that buffing wheel, it just slams the body of the bass against the floor and it shatters into like three pieces. Of course, everybody in the room turns around and looks, but it turns out like that happened about every couple of weeks. Somebody would, drop one. So I was in the buffing room for probably the first month I was there, but then I got to move over to the final assembly
I have a
slash quality
technical
control.
question.
Yes.
Would they be buffing that paint to then add another coat to make when you
Yeah.
say, okay.
So it would get buffed before going through to get like a clear coat spray on clear coat on it.
Gotcha.
And that process might be slightly different for different guitars, but most of the time, yeah, that's how that was going. And then I went from buffing into final assembly slash quality control, which is where you wanted to work if you were someone who actually played the instrument, because you got to play guitar all day, basically. There was about probably 10 of us, and everybody has this little enclosed, almost like soundproof booth if you close the door, where you've got your workbench to do all your setup work on the guitars. You got a guitar amp in there and a bass amp to plug everything in. You got to test everything to make sure it works. And then especially when you get into like the signature model guitars, each artist had, I mean, it was the guitar had to be set to the specifications that they wanted. So, like with the Eddie Van Halen guitar, like the string height had to be this certain measurement, and the height of the how high the pickups were set into the body, and there were all these sort of things. I mean, it was pretty meticulous.
Yeah.
Like they didn't just throw those things out. Like, you had to set it up, you go put it on a rack when you're done, and then there was a supervisor who came through who double checked all of your work before it got shipped out the door. And being a 19-year-old and not the most responsible person in the world, I would, I'd get my hands on a guitar that I thought was really cool, and I would play it far longer than I should. And
Alan.
one of my bands that I was playing in at the time, I wrote like our first batch of songs. I wrote them at work while working at Peavey. It doesn't matter. That factory doesn't even exist anymore. All of this is old. This is old news anyway. But
That's so killer. Are you a
yeah,
Van Halen fan?
I
It's not
am.
it's not automatic, Eddie Van
So
Halen.
my brother also worked at Peavey at the same fact. That's how I started working there. He got a job there.
What's the application process? I'm curious. How do you go in there and, how did that work?
I mean, this was 1999, so I'm pretty sure you drive down to the factory, go into the front office and fill out a paper application,
Yeah.
get called back for an interview, go back down there. But like when I transferred from being in the buffing department to going to final assembly, I had to do another little interview with the final assembly supervisor, and I actually had to play guitar for him to show him that I knew like what what good action on a guitar is supposed to feel like, and that I could actually play the instrument, and that I had an understanding of guitar. Like anywhere else in the factory, it wasn't mandatory that you played an instrument.
Yeah.
Most 99% of the people that worked there didn't play an instrument. Some of them probably didn't even know what some of the things they were working on even did. It was
Yeah.
just literally, there was a small town and they worked at this factory.
Yeah.
But to be in final assembly and working on the guitars and doing the setups and stuff, like you actually had to play and had to be knowledgeable about,
So
or
did you
you
play
know
some Eddie Van Halen for him?
no, I don't remember what I played, but I played something. But going back to your Van Halen question, my brother was a huge Van Halen, still to this day, like was a massive Van Halen fan. And Van Halen was one of those things as a kid that like I liked it, and I definitely understood the level of talent of not only Eddie Van Halen, but Alex Van Halen, who is
Oh
one
yeah.
of my all-time favorite drummers, and I think does not get adequate recognition for being as great as he is. But I think at some point growing up, like as I started to develop my own musical taste, a lot of what like my brother was listening to, I didn't want to listen to that. I wanted to listen to the stuff that I was into because we were 7 years apart in age, and I was always kind of like that. Like I wasn't really a classic rock person growing up. Like I always wanted new stuff. I was always searching for something that I felt like this is mine. Like this is a
Yeah.
thing that speaks to me, and I don't care if everybody else likes it. But over the years, and especially in the last few years, I've gone back and really like dug into listening to Van Halen again. I mean, it's kind of undeniable that that band has sort of like had a direct effect on my life and on multiple levels.
It's all quite genius what Eddie Van Halen. The whole band was
Yeah,
a what I call this supernova event.
for sure.
But I don't know if you know this about Van Halen, and I explained to you yesterday in our pregame about my obsession with the electric sitar. And do you know he used it on Ain't Talking About Love.
And I'll have to go now. I got to go re-listen.
You're gonna giggle when you listen. And there's interviews where he talks about doing it. It was a rental, and he did the weird stuff that Denny Diaz did. He was like, was there, and they decided to do this, and he decided to do overdubs and double the parts. And it's part of the real part of that Asian jam feeling that goes on with it, and Ain't Talking About Love.
I can picture exactly what section of the song
Yeah.
it would
Anyway,
be in.
But that's for you. And but he's got a history with electric sitar. He put it in other places too.
Well, so going back to the sort of like, I feel like I could probably back up a little bit as far as like PV and like if you grow up playing music in Mississippi, especially during the era that I grew up and everyone that sort of came in the sort of generation before me, like PV is just synonymous with that. A lot of people, that's like they don't, the only guitar amp they knew was a PV. I didn't meet any. It was years and years and years before I met anyone that owned a Marshall. You know, it's like everybody owned a PV because that was what was readily available. And on one hand, as a kid, you kind of start to think that like PV really isn't that cool, you know, because it's just like that's just the stuff everybody has. You wanted something a little more exotic. But in I think 1992, when the Eddie Van Halen signature model PV 5150 came out, that was like a huge, like game changing revitalization of that company. Suddenly, everybody was all interested in PV again. And my brother, being the gigantic Van Halen fan that he was, that was his first big, real, like professional level amp. Is he bought a PV 5150 half stack. We had never had that was our it was our first tube amp. Like our first amp that we had was a PV Backstage 30, which was a little, you know, solid state combo amp. And we'd had a couple of different variations of something similar, but we'd never played a tube amp before. And then here we were with this, like, he got this monster amp. You know, those amps kind of became very quickly sort of the go-to, like, high gain rock metal amp. And then, like, all those bands I was talking about that I played in Hattiesburg, the guitar player in that band had a couple of different 5150s. And one of the advantages of that was like if the amp broke, you could just drive it up to Meridian and drop it off at the PV factory and they could fix it for you there. And you get the amp back and it's like new again because they could fix it. And if they needed to replace something, it was replaced with the exact same factory component that was originally put in it. So I remember specifically one time his amp broke, my friend's amp broke, and like we drove up to Peavey one day, dropped it off, went to the mall in Meridian and went to the movies, watched a movie, hung out for a little bit, and then went and picked his amp up. And like that was kind of, you know, the advantage of like playing a Peavey and being right there in Mississippi is like we could just drive an hour up the road and get it repaired at the factory it was built in. But yeah,
Yeah.
so fast forward, my brother starts working at PV. You were going to say something?
No, no. So no,
Okay.
just go ahead.
So
I'm sorry.
my brother starts working at the PV factory, and I was like, man, that sounds
Now, the
cool.
one in Leakesville or the one in Meridian?
The one in Leakesville.
Okay.
So he gets a job there, and I end up working there too. You know, so like most of the time, like 90% of the time, we are setting up the Wolfgang Eddie Van Halen signature model guitars. And so I learned how to do guitar setups there. And a couple years before he and I worked there, Eddie came to that factory to tour the factory, you know, because he wanted to see where his guitars were being built. You know, he wanted to watch the whole process and everything. And one of the amps there that we used to test the guitars, Eddie played through it, and somebody took a marker and they marked all of the settings in the amp after he dialed it in the way he liked it, and they marked it. And we would all take turns playing through that amp with Eddie Van Halen's settings, and none of
Yes.
us sounded like Eddie Van Halen.
Can't do it.
It's because it's all in the hands.
And the fingers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it all comes from the person
Hey, what
and
did
not
you
the
think
amp.
about that guitar, the Wolfgang, when you were setting, when you were playing it? Like, was your feeling like, I gotta have one of these? Or, what was your feeling about that guitar?
I liked them. I mean, they were quality guitars at that time. Like it kind of didn't really suit the aesthetic of things that I was drawn to,
Yeah, that's
but I
important.
loved playing them at work, you
Yeah.
know, and they weren't like crazy expensive, but you know, for the time, they weren't a cheap guitar, you know, so it was like it wasn't aimed at people buying their first or second guitar. It's like, you know, if you're buying this guitar, you're probably a pretty serious guitar player.
It seems like everything PV does is, you and I talked about those T models. It was T40 and 260.
He's
Yeah, talk to me about those, about how you told me you own, tell me about this. Tell us the
Okay,
story.
by the time I worked at Peavey, the T60 had long been out of production. I think they stopped doing those like in the early or mid 80s. But the first electric guitar, my dad bought a used guitar and amp, and I guess kind of more for my brother because he was the guitar player. I was gravitating towards drums, but I think at the time that he bought that, I don't know if I had drums yet, and I always just kind of messed around on guitar, but. So he bought a PV Backstage 30 amp and a T60 guitar from just a guy he knew that was selling one. And kind of what I was telling you yesterday when we talked is that, this was in probably eight, maybe. So like I'd never seen a PV T60 guitar, like I didn't know what they were supposed to look like or what they were, but all we knew is we got this guitar and we were just like, cool, we got an electric guitar. But we noticed like when we played it, it was like it was really heavy on the back end. And if you were sitting down and you just had it on your leg and you tried to play it, it always wanted to like rock back this way because all the weight seemed to be centered at the back. And after a while, it was just like, man, I like playing guitar, but this is really annoying. We ended up trading that guitar in at like either a pawn shop or there was a little shop in our town that sold just old used music gear. We ended up trading it and getting something else. And it wasn't until years later I saw someone else that had a PVT 60. And I was like, we used to have a T60, but ours didn't look like that. And what we didn't realize is that the guy we bought it from, I don't know if he did it or if he had someone else do it, he had cut down the horns down to like the size of like a Gibson SG. But whoever did the work, like they did a great job because you couldn't tell, like it looked like it just came from the factory that way. But then once I saw someone else that had a T60, I was like, that's why the weight was all imbalanced, is because there was like two big chunks of wood that were missing from the body of the guitar. And but we
My
had no idea
goodness.
because it's just like I'd never seen like a PV catalog or anything. Like I didn't know what they were supposed to look like. But yeah, and it's crazy to think that now, like, I mean, those guitars are kind of collectible. Like people pay serious money for T60s. And they're really cool too. I actually saw one not long ago. Like I could probably be talked into buying one again.
If you Google T60 Mafia or something like that, you'll see. Do you know what that group of guys was like? Jerry Reed, and they were all playing T60s.
hmm
I've picked them up. Do you know Patrick Sweeney, blues band
I
Patrick
I don't
Sweeney?
know him personally. I know who I'm aware of him.
He's
I know
got
who he
one.
is, but
He's got one. I saw him play blues on it. It was interesting.
I'm sure it was great.
Okay, keep telling.
He's a real guitar player, as opposed to when I was telling you I'm a drummer who plays guitar
But and sorry if I failed to tell the listener that you do play drums, bass,
and guitar.
and guitar. Do you play any keyboards or anything like that?
Not, I mean, I know where all the notes are and I can make some sounds, but I'm not usable as a player on that
Yes,
instrument at all.
but you're doing a lot of home recording these days.
Yeah,
You're, when you're doing your home recording, are you playing most of the parts yourself, or are you working
all
with
of it.
some? Oh, wow, cool.
Right now, I'm in the process of putting a band together. Like I have a bass player and a drummer. We've had a couple of rehearsals, but don't have a vocalist yet. It's all still being put together, but I probably have, I mean, I have over an album's worth of instrumental material that I've demoed at home where I play all the guitar, bass, and drums on it.
Cool.
But it's not going to stay that, like it won't stay that way. I don't want it to be a solo project style thing. I want it to
Yeah,
be a band. This just literally like I had all this music and I have the means to make recordings of it. So, and I
yeah.
just enjoy the process.
You're fleshing it out.
Yeah. I like just being able to try different ideas and see how this sounds if I layer this part on top of this part and
Yeah.
all of that.
I'll be staying tuned. So we ran a little bit over. I wanted to try to stick it to an hour, not because when Alan and I did our pregame yesterday, I said, I want to have a quick phone call with you. And we were on the phone nearly 2 hours talking Pine Belt tone.
So there's a lot to talk about. I guess I don't know. Maybe you just need to like ask me specific questions about Peavey because I feel like there's so much stuff I could just ramble on about that all. I mean, it all kind of interconnects, but it's just that's such a. I don't think I even realized until you wanted to have this conversation that like how deep all of that history. Not only just Peavey itself as a company, but just like the correlation of growing up in Mississippi and all of that stuff all being interconnected and like how
Yeah.
much of a part of my life it has been, whether I've been aware of it or not.
Yes. And the reason why it appealed to me for my discussion, the lipstick pickup, as I started learning about Dan Aleccio, was another bootstrapping mid-century ding. Guys, I got a great idea. Hartley Peavey wanted to be a rock star and decided it was more pragmatic to build amplifiers. and um, and then you have Nat Daniel with the Dan Electro Corporation. Well, when I started doing research on the Dan Electro Corporation, people would say, I worked there. My dad worked there. You know, the factory there in Neptune City, New Jersey was a culture of its own. Somebody told me that they did some research on the Dan Electro Corporation and they would find these wedding announcements and things like this of people who had worked at the plant, you know, making announcement. And no, those people weren't musicians either.
Yeah.
That's why when you said, "Hey, not most people who work there weren't musicians," the same could be said for Dan Electro, including the founder.
Oh,
Daniel was not a musician. He didn't play music at all. He was an amplifier guy. So just like Peavy.
yeah.
I'm rambling now, but as far as like the minutia of the gear, they make so many things and they're still making stuff. Do you keep up with the modern day PV much at all? Or
Not a t I see stuff, but most of the time, most of the PV stuff I'm looking at, I'm usually like scouring Facebook Marketplace for people selling older stuff. I mean, that's
yeah.
the amp I currently have, I found on Facebook Marketplace. And the thing I love is like they made so many variations of different amps that like I'll find somebody selling a PV 212 combo from the late 70s or early 80s that has a name on it I've never seen before, you know, because there's the, you know, there's like there might be the PV Classic, which is before in the 90s they did the whole Tweed Classic series,
Mm-hmm.
which are great. But before that, there was one that was just called the PV Classic that was kind of ahead of its time because that in the 90s there kind of became this trend of companies making what they called hybrid amps of like tube preamp section with solid state power section
Mm-hmm.
like the Marshall Valve State, and Fender had one called the Fender Rock Pro. But the PV Classic of the early 80s was the reverse of that. It was a solid state preamp with a tube power amp. But it wasn't necessarily a big marketing point for them, I don't think. I think it was just like, I think they tried it and it worked and they put it out there. But, you know, there's just so many of those amps that you'll find that you know, some of which now, you know, now, I mean, there's been an online community for a while that you'll see the hashtag PV cult, especially applying to amps.
I did not know that. So have you heard this expression, dreams die, peevees don't? And one of the guy,
I follow an Instagram
yeah,
profile of that name.
he's you know, I don't know him. I can't remember his name. Is it John Jackson?
No
Anyway, I mean,
idea.
he's local here, and
I didn't
every time
realize that.
he's local, I believe he's local. But
Okay.
every time I ever engage with him, I'm always like, man, you got the killer. He's got the killer name. Dreams die, peevees don't. But I'd never heard that. What you just told me. What did you just say? It was PV cult. I'd never heard that.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of more centered around amps
Yeah.
because there's a lot of like, obviously you've heard the term Mississippi Marshall,
Yes.
right? So it kind of that kind of applies to a lot of PV built a lot of amps in the early 80s that were kind of almost like their amp to sort of compete with the Marshall JCM 800.
Yeah.
And so there was the PV Butcher, there was the PV Rockmaster. These were like just single channel tube heads that if you cranked them up all the way, they, you know, had a lot of gain to them, and it was kind of that similar sound to like, you know, like Randy Rhoads playing with Ozzy Osbourne. He was using a Marshall JCM 800, but it's like
Hmm.
that was those PV amps, like that's what you could get a similar tone from in those. And but yeah, there's all of these sort of like kind of almost forgotten amps of that era that a lot of guys like people that were playing like the sort of like doom sludge metal stuff where they're basically just kind of taking Sabbath riffs and tuning them down.
Yeah.
Those amps are kind of perfect for that,
Yeah.
even though that may not have been their intent when they were built back then, but it's, they are, and it's like they kind of develop a cult following. My good friend Spence Townsend that I played in bands with in Hattiesburg at one time owned, talking about that Peavey, the 90s era Tweed classic series. He
Hmm.
had a bass amp that was the classic 400 that aren't always easy to find, but those were comparable to like an Ampeg SDT or a Mesa Boogie 400. They're these big 400-watt tube heads and they sound awesome, but you don't see anyone using them now because they weigh like 120 pounds. Like they're massive. But people, especially the people who are into the whole like PV cult thing, like they love those amps. Yeah, that
I had a pedal steel player tell me that their pedal steel amps are prized
yes.
for that being especially good for pedals. Did you know that?
I did, and I actually found I randomly saw someone selling an amp the other day that is one of those, like there were a few different models and they weren't even necessarily like high-end expensive models of PVs, but I'd never heard of it before, but there's an old one called a PV Vegas
Mm-hmm.
that's just a 112 combo amp, and that's one of the ones that apparently steel players love that amp.
Yeah.
A few years back, I was playing with an artist and we opened for John Anderson, and the steel player in his band was just playing a PV amp that was probably from the late 80s, and he had been playing that same amp for years.
Did you go up to him and say, "Where are you from?"
No, but I just it was one of those things that like I made a little mental note of that. It's like,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, that's really what I wanted to talk about as far as Peavey, not to go, I'm not a musician. I can't go down a rabbit hole about all the different models, but
Mhm.
what I wanted to do was tackle Peavey as a cultural entity, and I think we did it. It was meaningful, like just the culture, just the logo itself
Yeah.
smells like pine trees.
Yeah.
I want to wrap it up because I don't want to go on too long, but tell me what you
Okay.
told me about that logo. I thought that was interesting. You were telling me about PV logo and then a newer one on those some Eddie Van Halen amps or
So when the
something.
5150 came out in 1992, that was kind of the beginning of them using a different logo other than the classic one that everyone knows, that depending on who you ask, some people love it, some people hate it. I've even had mixed feelings about it in my lifetime because, like I was said, when I was younger, it was like I didn't really care about PV because PV was everywhere. You always, but you would see the bands on TV playing Marshalls. It was like I wanted a Marshall, but then they changed the logo for the 5150, and then they made a bunch of other amps throughout the 90s and maybe even into the thousands that had the new logo on it. And it's kind of whatever. They eventually started going back and using the old logo again. Um, and it's kind of like everything. Like when things reach a certain age, suddenly there becomes this sort of like retro revitalization of it. Um,
I see it everywhere I look, the big white shoes and the mom jeans and the acid wash and people
yeah,
driving the American cars that would have been death to your social life have now become this cool hipster thing, this weird boxy K car, it's like, look at my
yeah.
car. It's like, what is happening? Everything will eventually come back around. I think that's why another reason why I keep all those CDs. People keep telling me it's never coming back around, but you
It
just
will. I
well,
mean,
it will.
cassettes have kind of come back in a minor way.
They've even dusted off these 8 tracks, and let me tell you, that was not a great system
No, no, I'm old enough to remember those too. Like, yeah.
in a car. Well, is there anything else you want to add before I reluctantly draw this to a close? Because I need some food. I could talk to you all day about Pine Belt, and I hope you'll come back on
Oh yeah, absolutely.
when you get some stuff going with your music. And you know what I would love to do? Have you ever played an electric sitar? I mean,
I have not.
I want to show you mine and let you look at it one day.
I have once played an actual sitar,
Yeah.
but never an electric one.
Well, they have an interesting history in metal.
Oh yeah.
So when I went deep in metal, I'm finding
Hmm.
just guitar lords, and I don't try to be, I'm not really an authority on this type of music, metal music. I don't really understand it as much as other people, but it's there and it's out there and it's really interesting. Guitarists have done very sophisticated things with it in metal. Hey, are
Yeah,
you a Smashing Pumpkins fan?
yeah, I am.
He's got a history with it.
I actually learned that from you mentioning it recently. I don't think I had realized, and I think that's kind of the fascinating thing about that instrument is that it probably shows up on a lot of albums more often than people would think. Kind of in the same way that like I watched a documentary years ago. I'm pretty sure it was about the Elton John album Goodbye Yellow Brick Road.
Hmm.
There's banjo all over that record.
Yes.
But you don't, but it's not played, it's not like banjo music, but it's like sometimes it's just mimicking a simple guitar line or something.
Yes.
But if you don't know it's there, you may not notice it. But then once someone tells you and you know to listen for it, you're able to pick it out. And I feel like that's kind of a similar thing with the electric guitar is that
Yeah.
it's probably, especially in rock music, it's probably on so much stuff that like I've never even thought about or realized that it was there. But
It was often used for overdubs and to create some ambience, and then sometimes it's just so exquisitely placed there, just like the banjo on. And I know what you're talking about, the banjo. This
Mhm.
whole listening exercise has given me a great ear for banjo because they sometimes sound like each other because of the repercussive qualities of them, the resonating
Mhm.
qualities. But I was listening to an old Billy Joel record. I'm like, there's banjo all over this record and it's brilliant.
Yeah.
And I was listening. It was like Piano Man.
Mhm.
And it's a jazz player named such and such. He's the guy who played dueling banjos on Deliverance. And he was a jazz player, but he enjoyed banjo and he did a lot of banjo session work. But you're right. You have to pay attention to it. And I've got one for you. I went to look at your feed to see what you had been up to recently to remind myself, and I saw you getting excited about seeing Dinosaur Jr.
Yeah.
Okay, Dinosaur Jr. I got some songs for you on my
Oh
list.
boy.
I'm going to play one for you before we sign off. You're going to have to indulge me.
Play whatever you want. I love Dinosaur Jr. One of my favorite bands.
They are really my generation, but I'm not as knowledgeable as other people, but I certainly understand their, sorry, you're going to have to bear with me.
Oh yeah.
The Wagon.
Yeah.
I went to look it all up when I started finding that Jay Mascis had a history with this instrument, and I found an old, they're on some late night TV show, and he's playing one of these.
Yeah.
He's playing a baby sitar. So it's all. I
Yeah.
mean, that's why I got so hooked into the story. Is it's underreported. So
Mhm.
and around Nashville, you and I, we have the same hometown. I would try to talk to guitar players about it, and they go, "Oh yeah, they used it on a couple of songs." I'm like, "Okay, guys, just so you know, they use it on a bunch of stuff, and I want everybody to know what it was. Most people don't know it's there." And then it started becoming a fun thing. Like I still to this day, I love Scott for jumping onto the bandwagon, and now he's letting me know when he hears it and the music that he's listening to.
Yeah.
Scott. Anyway, I appreciate you talking tone with me today.
Yes, it was fun.
I'm calling my podcast studio here my tone booth.
Nice.
Time
I
to
like
hang.
it.
It's time to hang up though because I need lunch.
Same here.
Hey, I hope you have a
Uh,
great. My best to Kathy.
Yes, I will be sure and tell her.
It was so nice having you on the Lipstick Pickup podcast, Alan Jones of Nashville, Tennessee, and we're going to have him on again. I hope everybody loved learning about the Peavey Factory. I can't thank you enough for your time. I've sucked 4 hours out of your weekend.
It was fun.
What else are you going to do?
Right.
No, I know you
Right.
stay busy, and I appreciate you taking the time with me. We had a great time. All right. Say
Yeah.
goodbye to my listeners.
All right. Bye, listeners.
Bye. Bye. I'm going to hit stop. If you hear excellent tone and the sound of birds chirping, it means you've made it through an entire episode of the Lipstick Pickup podcast. You're as free as a bird now, but I hope you'll join me again soon. Comments or questions? I can be reached at emily@thelipstickpickup.com.